Okay, great. Thanks for waiting.
So,
So,
it's a little funny, I know.
we'll begin from the beginning, right?
begin
So
from
is
the
it recording now?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I hope it is. Sorry.
All right, so as I was saying, this show was put together for the Association of Retired Faculty at Cal State University Northridge, and it was intended to present a reflection of my experiences of the Soviet Union prior to its collapse. That began in 1966, and so we covered the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s, in rough chronological but not perfect chronological order. And the commentary that I will make today to this family group would be somewhat different from what I said to the Association of Retired Faculty. For one thing, I needed to get through them pretty quickly. Here, if you have questions, we can stop and discuss a particular slide and so on. And if you get fed up, we can stop.
And we have a full bottle of vodka.
And we have a full bottle of vodka.
But we don't have it
And
yet,
so,
so the
as I was-
experience is ruined.
Peanut galleries.
So my first travel to the Soviet Union was in 1967 for a year of graduate study to assemble material for my dissertation, PhD dissertation. And it took a couple of efforts to get approval from the Soviets for me to come, because it was a strict exchange program. There would be 30 Americans would go to the Soviet Union, 30 Soviets would come to the United States. The people who went to the Soviet Union were usually historians, literature people, linguists, people of that sort. The people who came to the United States, at that time at least, were usually scientists. And that was because obviously the Soviet Union wanted to get as much technical information as it could, and also because American scientists were simply not really interested in giving up a year to go to Russia, whereas people who were studying the language and the literature, they were dying to go. And so, as a geographer, I was kind of an exception, really. It was fairly unusual for them to let geographers in. Not completely unknown, but it was much easier for a literature person to get in. And so the exchange program, among the rules at that time which were enforced, was that a scholar could go to the Soviet Union with a spouse, but couldn't bring children with him, him or her. And but the exchange program would resettle a family in Western Europe somewhere, so that you could get out of the Soviet Union at least once during the year and visit your family. And so Faith and I decided that we would live in England because, or that she would live in England because there wouldn't be a language issue. And we had the old Peugeot, the blue Peugeot wagon delivered in Southampton, picked it up and started driving around England. We only had a couple of weeks for her to get settled in. And that was up to the individual, him or herself, you know. They said, yes, we'll support the family in England, but we won't find housing for you. You have to find it yourself. So we started driving. We thought we would go to a university city. Went to Oxford, couldn't find anything there. Went on to Cambridge. In Cambridge we found this nice little house, which Jonathan may remember. And got Faith settled there. And then I had to get to Helsinki to join the exchange group, because the exchange group was going to move into the Soviet Union altogether. So I found that this ship was sailing from Tilbury, the port of London, and it's the Nadezhda Krupskaya small passenger ship, and going as far as Stockholm. And I had an aunt there, Auntie Zhenya, and fine, so I thought I'll go to Stockholm, I'll say hello to Auntie Zhenya, and then I'll take the train or something else to get to Helsinki. So, as I was saying before, I got on the ship, and I was in an inside cabin sharing it with a Finn, kind of an older guy, who was a real drunkard. And the trouble is he couldn't hold his liquor. And so during the voyage, if things got a bit rough, he would start throwing up, and it wasn't a lot of fun. But eventually I got to Stockholm and I saw Antigenia, and then I took the train around the Gulf of Bothnia, in other words, all the way up to northern Sweden, around the corner, and then down to Helsinki. And that's about where we were when you set up. So the next slide is we're still in London, and before the exchange group went to the Soviet Union, we had a meeting in Indiana, at Indiana University, which was the headquarters of the exchange program, for indoctrination, and we were addressed by people who had been on the exchange before us, and they told us what we needed to, what would be a good idea to take along. And the Soviet Union in 1966, after all, it was barely 20 years after the end of World War II, there were tremendous shortages of a lot of things. And so we were given whole lists of things we should take along, and I took them too seriously, really. And so I wound up with a foot locker and a special nice little trunk I found, and I loaded it with all kinds of stuff. It was quite a struggle to get it to the Moscow University dorm, but I might say that once I was established at Moscow University, everybody else in the exchange group would come and ask if I had this and
because
that.
you had everything.
And so I became the supplier for all kinds of odds and ends that I brought along, tools and spare parts and this, that, and the other.
Where it comes from.
I have this picture home in my album. I have this picture. Oh
Now,
my
I
God.
don't know if this was taken in '66 or some other, I don't know.
I have it in my
Because
family album.
It
But-
could have been 84, Bob. Look at the earth is
It could have been later,
kind of
yeah.
white.
Ah,
Yeah, later.
Oh,
yeah, was a mistake.
So this was my home for
Yeah,
a year, MGU, Moscow State University.
Central.
I remember it wasn't lit up like that all the time. It was just for holidays and so on. And it was in the winter when I took this picture, and there was a lot of snow on the ground. And I remember I slugged through a lot of snow to get far enough away that I could get this picture. And I must have taken 3 or 4. All the others did not turn out well. But this one is good. It's
Yeah.
pretty nice and sharp.
Actually,
Now, this is the view from the spire, not right at the top, but pretty high up, Moscow University, looking at the Moscow of 1966-67, which looks completely different
I don't
today.
recognize
You know,
that.
you don't even
I
recognize it.
don't recognize it.
In the foreground are the grounds of the university, okay?
Wow.
That may be still somewhat similar. Then you see the Moskva River making its big bend.
Yeah.
Just across there is Lenin Stadium.
Yeah, we just
Okay.
stood there.
And then you look at the fabric of the city. I mean, you can see that we're on the Moscow Plain. We're only about 600 feet above sea level, I think. One of the highest spots in Central European Russia, anyway. And you can almost see the curvature of the earth,
Yeah.
in the distance.
Yep.
And the city had essentially the only high rises then were the so-called Stalin skyscrapers.
Yep.
Like Moscow University, there were half a dozen or 10 of them, I forget how many.
10. Yeah.
10, okay. Like the Foreign Ministry,
Foreign
and
Ministry,
some apartment houses.
Big
Some
apartment house.
Ukraine hotel, I think.
Yeah.
Ukraina,
Something,
that's
yeah.
right, Ukraine Hotel, and
I
so
don't know
on.
all 10, I never.
And all the rest of Moscow was like, 4 stories, 6 stories,
Flats, yeah.
2,
Khrushchev.
and Khrushchevki, Pятиэтажная Moskva, and so on. And so it's an interesting historic picture, because if you took the same picture today,
Yeah.
it would look completely different.
Absolutely. I doesn't trigger. I mean, I know the stadium, but that's it. Everything else is right now visually different.
Okay, well, research, as I mentioned at dinner time or after dinner, this was in an archive. I forget which one, but the way research was conducted was there were no open stacks. You had to request what you
Yep.
wanted. They would bring it to you, and then you sat at a desk with a notebook and a pen,
Yep.
and you would copy and
I
copy
still
and
remember
copy
that.
and copy. And I discovered after about several months of it that it was just too slow for what I wanted. For one thing, I was doing the historical geography of Moscow, which involves a lot of old maps. I didn't need modern maps, but I did want the old maps, 19th century map. And so I got special permission, which involved politics and getting very friendly with the librarian at the Museum of the History and Reconstruction of Moscow, to get permission to make my own microfilm using my own single lens reflex and black and white film. And so when I went out to visit Faith at Christmas time, I went to a big department store somewhere, and I bought a tripod which could be reversed so it would become a copy stand. I had acquired lights at Detski Mir, the department store right near the museum, and I bought film, black and white film in 50-foot rolls, and a lot of blank cassettes which I would load myself. So every day, every night I would load cassettes. The next day I would go to the museum, shoot them up. Then that night, Volodya would remember that I also brought developing chemicals in a developing tank, and I would process the film because I needed to make sure that what I had shot was turning out. Otherwise I'd just be wasting my time. And it all worked out, and I brought a lot of film back to the States, and I used a lot of it in writing my dissertation. So this is just a shot down in a library. Obviously old-fashioned card catalogs were in use at that time. Now here I am.
The rooms are, yeah, very recognizable. They're still the same, very narrow, long.
Right, and at MGU, foreigners like me, each of us would get the entire little room to himself, and through the partition to the right, we would have a Soviet roommate. And my Soviet roommate was, of course, Volodya. And you're looking at about 2/3 of the room right there. So my little bed is to the left. You get a bookcase. You have a reading lamp. It was really okay, you know. And the two little rooms would form what was called a block. And the block, as you open the outer door, there'd be a small vestibule, and on one side would be a sink, and on the a sink and a shower. I forget how. Yeah, no, it's sink on one side, shower on the other.
On the other side.
Right, and there was a shared kitchen down the hall, you know, for that floor. And so I had a certain amount of privacy, and so I was able to develop film at night. But the way that Soviet students were assigned to these rooms was there would be two in each side.
Yeah.
And so that really got pretty crowded because it was a wall-to-wall beds pretty much. Now one of those trunks that you saw at Tilbury is actually on the right side of the picture under that pile of paper or newspapers or whatever it was. That was the reserved trunk of stuff for people to borrow.
From the stores.
That's so funny.
Did she live on campus or commute?
And
No, I commute. I do.
now this was not taken in '66.
Oh my God.
This was taken on some other later trip
yes.
when I had a beard. But there I am with Volodya, and I remember we went to visit. We went to visit our old room, you know.
Oh yeah.
Zona Ver, 568, 568.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Now again, this is
Sorry.
at a different time. This would have been in the 80s.
84. 84, yes, 84.
But
No, it's not focused.
this is at the museum.
Yeah.
Now
Everybody else is focused by Robert.
Yeah.
Yes.
the woman who was the supervisor of that library when in 67 had retired, but she did come and say hello, and the person who had been her deputy in 66, 67 became the head librarian, and she's the lady at the far right. and a very good friend. We became very good friends.
Yeah.
And you can see the little tea,
Oh, yes.
tea and cookies
Typical
session
Russians
that
that,
took place
yeah.
every afternoon.
Oh, yes.
You know, I'd be working there, shooting a black and white film, and they would come and say, Robert, it's time for tea.
You're getting too busy, yeah, you have to stop working.
So it was really very nice, a very chummy atmosphere,
Really?
and much better than the cold kind of atmosphere of the average archive,
Yes.
where they really didn't, you know, they really
Yeah.
didn't like people touching their stuff.
Yeah.
And but I was very lucky actually in the situation that I was able to put together.
Oh my God.
Now this is taken probably in the winter of 66, 67.
Yep.
As looking out of our room, zona VIP, it's up 68. And you can see that the university was enclosed by a wall or a fence.
It's
And in
still,
order to get in and out, you had to pass through one of those little houses there. And you had to show your pass. Everybody got ID.
student pass, yeah.
University ID, and you know, they weren't terribly strict about it. It was usually little old ladies sitting there, but they would check on, make sure that you belonged in the university.
I think
And-
we still have IDs.
And you can see that had been a lot of snow, and there's one kind of landmark which Volodya would remember, because as an official exchange scholar, we had certain official privileges with the American embassy. And among the privileges was shopping in the special diplomatic stores, and also using the commissary at the embassy and the lunch counter and so on. And the diplomatic stores at that time would sell liquor to diplomats without any taxes at all. And so what you're looking there is the ghostly image of a Beefeater gin bottle.
That's right, the red
That
cap.
was my father's ultimately favorite. Absolutely, specifically.
Where we figured out
Beefeater.
how to make gin and tonic and
Yep.
stuff like that.
Yep.
And you know, I introduced Volodya to a lot of wicked Western ways.
Wicked Western culture thing,
Definite
yeah.
Western ways.
Also in that picture is the Chinese embassy in the far distance. And 66, 67, if you'll recall, was then there was a lot of conflict
Yeah.
between the Great Leap Forward in China, and the Soviet Union and China were not friendly at all.
I don't know,
And
I'm
so
sorry.
the Chinese embassy was virtually abandoned at that time.
Wow. Because this is exactly the store.
This was
And I remember
the
this
diplomatic store, actually completely shuttered. You can't see what's going on
No.
inside.
Yep.
And I have a few pictures of the inside, though I don't think I include them here.
I do remember
But that
this
is
place.
that is where the Beefeater gin would come from. It would cost like $2 a bottle or something like that, something ridiculous. This is just a nice Russian scene, you
Yeah.
know,
Very
with traditional
Russian
birch
setup,
trees
yeah.
and the soul of Russia.
Also very
And this is another aspect of Russia which impressed me, is because at that time, of course, agriculture was conducted entirely by kolkhozy and sovkhozy, collective farms and state farms,
Yep.
and they were huge, you know, they were very large territories which were owned or administered by the government in one way or another. And so it was very different from an American agricultural scene in a way, because the fields would be monoculture of one crop, rye or wheat or barley, whatever it would go on for miles.
Yep. Yep.
And off in the distance you would see a lonely tractor, you know, working away. Now this is the Upper Volga at Yaroslavl,
Yeah, I don't think, yeah.
and the rivers played a very important historic role in transportation in Russia, of course, because obviously it's much easier to float up and down a river than to negotiate your way through the forest. And even in the winter, they could be used for transportation in the old days, not in modern time, because once the river froze, you could send sleighs and sleds down the frozen river.
Yep. It's a perfect road, yeah.
Now this I did not take a photo, but it's such a famous photograph.
Yeah.
It's sort of the equivalent of the Iwo Jima flag raising for the American. And this is the Soviet flag going up over the Reichstag in Berlin. And somebody told me that actually just as, I think in Iwo Jima they restaged it.
Yeah, they restaged it,
I
yeah.
think the same thing happened here.
But I mean, it was the same guy, the same person, he in fact put the flag,
Yes.
but they asked him to repeat it, basically, yeah. And it was, I mean, very close in time, and so it was almost immediately.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, you know, it's understandable.
Yeah.
It's,
So
it's a very important symbolic.
Yeah, it's quite, I
image,
forgive
you know.
them for a stage, and it's okay.
And of course, this is to illustrate, to remind everyone that the Second World War took a tremendous toll on the
Yeah.
Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and all the rest of it, and 6 million Jews were exterminated and so on. But it's estimated that the Soviet Union lost about 20 million people
Yep.
as a result of the war. And so every little village or town would have memorials of many kinds, you know. And this is kind of typical, with long lists of people who had died and everywhere you went in the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union of the 60s and 70s almost created a mythology of World War II, which was, it was a sort of a unifying theme that, you know, we all fought together against the fascist hordes and we conquered and so on. Hidden underneath that, of course, no mention of the Ukrainian starvation, under collectivization,
Yeah.
and no mention of the Great Terror of the 1930s,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. A lot of things not talked about. But World War II was played up pretty heavily.
The Great Patriotic War.
Yeah, it is kind of separated, yeah. Like a specific term in Russian, it's Great Patriotic War, correct. This is Moscow.
And somewhat late in the day, they got the idea that it would be a good idea to have an internal flame. And so this is the eternal flame by the walls of the Kremlin. And it also had a permanent guard, of course,
Yeah.
and so on. I forget when it was opened, but it wasn't until the 60s. Now this is down in Chisinau, capital of Moldova, what was then the Moldavian SSR. And I went down there towards the end of the exchange year. And the reason I went to Chisinau, I was the only student who wanted to go there, was because my father came from Chisinau.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was born there. And so I was hoping to maybe find some trace of the family or something like that. And of course, Moldova was right on the border with Romania,
Yeah.
was one of the first territories that was occupied.
Yeah.
And any Jews that didn't escape before that, they would all be exterminated, you
Yeah.
know. And so left behind in Chisinau was one geography professor who happened to be Jewish. He was
Really?
teaching in Moldova University or something like that. And they arranged for him to meet me.
Oh, that's
And he
nice.
showed me around. And this is the wall of the Jewish cemetery in Chisinau, which was used as an execution ground.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Hang on, let me flip that camera. Just take 1 second.
This is ruins of the synagogue. I guess.